Summer, 1944. Somewhere deep in the American Midwest, the sun hangs low over a prisoner of war camp. The heat is dry, the air shimmering above the dirt road that cuts between rows of barbed wire. Beyond the fence, a handful of American soldiers are gathered around a makeshift grill. They're laughing, drinking from tin cups, flipping something golden over the fire. The smell drifts through the fence, sweet, smoky, buttery. A dozen German women stand watching, their faces shaded beneath issued khaki caps. One of them, tall and sharp-eyed, squints. Tierfutter, she mutters under her breath. Animal feed. The women around her chuckle, some crossing their arms, others shaking their heads. They eat what we give to pigs, one says, half disgusted, half amused. To them, corn was never food. In Germany it filled troughs, not plates. And seeing these confident Americans eating it as if it were a delicacy? It felt absurd. Proof, they thought, that victory had made the enemy soft, primitive, even. On the other side of the fence, the Americans keep laughing, oblivious to the mockery. They brush melted butter across the kernels, sprinkle on salt, and bite into the steaming cobs with pleasure. The crack of teeth meeting sweetness echoes faintly in the summer air. Helga Richter, the woman who said Tierfutter, watches a moment longer, her face unreadable. The smell lingers longer than she'd like. And though she turns away, something in her doesn't quite follow. The camp wasn't what Helga had expected. It was fenced, yes, guarded, ordered, but nothing like the brutal compounds she'd heard about on the Eastern Front. Instead of gray mud and hunger, there was sky. Endless, overpowering sky. Fields stretched in every direction, stitched together with the deep green of crops she didn't recognize. The women slept in wooden barracks that smelled of soap and straw. They rose early, worked in the nearby fields, and returned with dirt on their hands but enough food to quiet the ache in their stomachs. For many, it was the first time in months they'd eaten without rationing or fear. But there was humiliation too, the quiet kind. The realization that they were prisoners in a land that seemed untouched by war. The Americans talked casually about abundance, about harvest festivals, and county fairs, as if the world beyond the barbed wire wasn't burning. Helga couldn't decide whether to despise them or envy them. The guards sang as they worked, their laughter carried by the wind. It was foreign music, unscarred by desperation. She looked out at the rows of tall green plants, corn, again, waving like banners of plenty, and felt something sharp twist inside her. Look at them, Elsa murmured beside her, wiping sweat from her brow. They grow food for their animals and still have enough to waste on us. Helga nodded, her jaw tightening. They don't understand hardship, she said. They've never had to. And yet, when the evening breeze carried that same sweet scent of grilled corn from the other side of the camp, she found herself inhaling deeper than she meant to. Before the war, Helga Richter had been a woman of precision. A Wehrmacht logistics officer, responsible for fuel routes, rations, the invisible arteries that kept an army alive. She'd studied engineering in Dresden, one of the few women to rise through the ranks on competence alone. Her world had been measured in numbers, timetables, and control. And control was something she'd lost the moment she stepped off the transport truck onto American soil. Here, she was no longer an officer, no longer Fräulein Richter, the efficient mind behind supply operations on the Eastern Front. She was just another uniform stripped of insignia, another foreign face in a camp full of barbed wire and sunlight. Helga adapted outwardly. She worked hard, spoke little, followed rules, but inwardly, she catalogued everything. The size of the fields, the rhythm of the guards' patrols, the variety of crops, the way the soil here seemed to give without resistance. It bothered her, how easy it all looked. Germany had been a land of scarcity, every harvest a calculation, every loaf of bread a triumph. Yet here, in this faraway place untouched by bombers, things simply grew. Sometimes she would watch an American tractor move across the horizon, slow and steady, sunlight glinting off its frame, and think, this country has never been hungry. That night, as she lay awake on the narrow cot, the smell of earth clinging to her skin, she thought again of that corn, the one the soldiers had eaten so joyfully. She didn't understand it. She wasn't sure she wanted to. In Germany, corn was not food. It was a warning sign of famine. For generations, maize had filled the troughs of pigs and cattle, coarse, starchy, almost indigestible for humans. The kind that grew there was futtermaize, animal feed, meant for strength, not taste. In Helga's childhood, even the poorest families would never eat it unless the winter was cruel enough to strip the shelves bare. To do so was to confess desperation. Corn meant failure. So when the war came and the rations thinned, Helga remembered her mother whispering angrily while grinding cornmeal. "This is not food. This is shame." The yellow mush that resulted, bitter, grainy, unchewable, had stayed in her memory as vividly as the sound of sirens. To see the Americans roasting whole ears and eating them with laughter, it felt absurd, almost grotesque. A people so rich they didn't know what hunger truly was. To Helga, that golden corn was proof of American ignorance, not sophistication. She told herself that as she worked the fields near the camp fence, her hands blistering under the foreign sun. But even as she repeated the words, "It's for pigs, not people," a small, disobedient part of her wondered. Why did it smell so sweet? Why did the soldiers eat it with such visible joy? It was a scent that lingered in her mind longer than it should have, the smell of something her entire culture had already decided was beneath them. By late August, the camp buzzed with a different kind of energy. The guards had spent weeks watching the cornfields outside the perimeter turn gold, and now the harvest had come. They decided to celebrate the way they would back home, with food, laughter, and a fire big enough to be seen from every corner of the compound. They invited a few prisoners to help with preparations. Not as guests, but as workers, to shuck, to peel, to carry water from the pump. The gesture was half practical, half peace offering. Helga stood among them, sleeves rolled to her elbows, the late sun burning orange across the fields. The Americans worked casually, their movements unhurried, confident. They joked, hummed songs that sounded like river water, smooth, repetitive, alive. She noticed how easily they handled the corn, how they treated it not as feed or necessity but as celebration. When the first ears hit the flame, the air changed. Butter melted down the sides, sizzling as it met the coals. The smell was intoxicating, sweet, smoky, alive in a way that reminded Helga of something she couldn't name. One of the guards, a young man with dark hair and easy eyes, grinned at her as he turned the corn. "Good job?" he asked in broken German. Helga looked away. "Pig food," she replied curtly. The guard only laughed, as if he'd heard the line before. As dusk fell, the camp glowed with firelight. The soldiers began to eat, teeth cracking through the kernels, butter dripping onto their sleeves. The prisoners watched in silence, until the laughter started. And then came the word again, sharp as a blade through the smoke, "Tierfutter." The laughter spread like wildfire among the prisoners. Elsa, a younger woman with a wiry frame, pointed at the soldiers biting into the steaming cobs. "Look at them! They eat what we give to pigs!" Her voice carried over the crackling of the fire, sharp with disbelief. Helga joined in, forcing a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Ridiculous," she said, shaking her head. "They've no idea what real food is." The Americans didn't seem offended. They shrugged, smiled, and continued eating, as if the mockery was part of the ritual. One guard, older and quieter than the rest, simply said, "You don't know what you're missing." His words carried a weight, but Helga dismissed it. For a moment, she allowed herself to enjoy the superiority she felt. Here they were, soldiers from a defeated country, mocking their captors' food. She could cling to that, a small victory in a life that had been reduced to following orders, counting days, and working under the sun. Yet the smell lingered. Sweet, smoky, tempting, a scent that refused to leave her memory. Helga didn't want to admit it, but a tiny, irritating curiosity had planted itself inside her. And though she tried to focus on her pride, she couldn't stop glancing at the golden cobs in the firelight, glistening with butter, their kernels promising something her imagination could not yet define. Private James Miller was unlike most of the soldiers Helga had observed. A farm boy from Iowa, he had hands worn from planting and harvesting long before the war. His knowledge of corn was instinctive. The way it grew, the way it bent to the sun, the way it could sustain a family through winter. To him, the golden ears on the grill were not oddities. They were everyday miracles. Miller noticed Helga standing apart, arms crossed, eyes wary. He didn't scold, didn't argue, didn't laugh. Instead, he approached the fence the next morning with a single, still steaming ear of corn in his hands. "Try it," he said in careful German, his accent soft but clear. "You'll like it." Helga's brow furrowed. Pride rose like a wall inside her chest. "No," she said, shaking her head. He didn't push. He merely placed the ear on the fence post and gave her a nod, as if offering peace or perhaps a challenge. Then he walked away, leaving the golden corn glistening in the morning light. Helga stared at it, the steam curling in the early sun. Her hunger whispered, curiosity tugged, and pride, stubborn, inflexible, held her back. But that single ear, resting quietly in the fence, was an invitation she couldn't ignore forever. For hours, Helga stared at the ear of corn. It sat there, warm, golden, almost taunting her from the fence post. She thought of her mother's words about corn, coarse, bitter, fit only for pigs. She thought of her training, her pride, her belief that she knew better. And yet hunger whispered louder than pride. Finally, with no one watching, she reached out and broke off a single kernel between her fingernails. She lifted it to her lips, hesitant, almost fearful. The first bite shocked her. Soft, sweet, juicy. The kernel burst like sugar on her tongue, and the smoky butter flavor wrapped around it in harmony. It was nothing like the coarse, bitter corn of Germany, nothing she had ever imagined possible. A second bite, and then a third. Helga's eyes widened. The mockery, the laughter, the sense of superiority, all of it faltered under the sheer delight of taste. She felt foolish, ashamed even, but also exhilarated. Somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered, "We were wrong." And in that quiet moment, the camp faded. There were no guards, no fences, no war. Only the warmth of the fire, the sweetness of corn, and a realization that something she had dismissed her entire life might hold truths far beyond her expectations. That night, Helga lay awake on the narrow cot, the taste of corn lingering like a stubborn memory. She turned it over in her mind, trying to reconcile it with everything she had believed. Sweet, soft, alive? None of it matched the corn she knew from Germany. This was something else entirely. A new kind of food, a new kind of knowledge, a challenge to everything she had assumed about the world outside her borders. She whispered to Elsa, who had noticed her distraction. "It was an animal feed," she murmured, almost afraid the words might escape into the room. Elsa blinked. "What?" Helga repeated herself, quieter this time. "It was sweet." The younger woman laughed lightly. "You're letting captivity rot your senses, Helga." Helga didn't respond. She turned toward the wall, staring at the dark wooden boards. Something inside her had shifted. Pride had yielded to curiosity, arrogance had softened into reflection. She realized that dismissing something without truly experiencing it could blind even the most intelligent minds. For the first time, she questioned not just American practices, but her own assumptions. And that small seed of doubt, like the corn planted by Miller, was ready to grow. The following days, Helga observed the corn more closely. She walked along the rows after work, brushing her fingers over the stalks, inspecting the kernels. They were plump, tender, vibrant, nothing like the fibrous maize she remembered from Germany. She began asking questions, in broken English and German, to the American guards and farmers. How was it grown? Why was it different? The answers surprised her. This was not ignorance, as she had assumed. It was science, patience, and generations of selective breeding. Sweet corn had been cultivated in America for over a century, hybrids carefully chosen for flavor and tenderness. The Germans had dismissed corn as animal fodder, never experimenting, never imagining it as a human staple. Helga felt a strange mix of admiration and humility. The soldiers she had mocked, the food she had scorned, they represented knowledge Germany had overlooked, possibilities Germany had ignored. It was a revelation. And with it came an unsettling thought. She had spent so long believing in her own superiority that she had failed to see the ingenuity in another culture, ingenuity that now seemed brilliant, deliberate, almost effortless. Helga could no longer dismiss what she had tasted. Every day she found herself watching the American soldiers in the fields, noticing the meticulous care they gave to their crops. Private Miller became an informal teacher without meaning to. He would show her how to inspect kernels, how to tell if a stalk had been properly pollinated, how the soil's moisture determined not just the crop's size but its flavor. One morning, after the harvest celebration had ended, Helga approached Miller at the edge of the field. "What kind of corn was that?" she asked, her voice softer than usual, almost hesitant. Miller tilted his head, surprised that the once proud officer was asking instead of sneering. "Sweet corn," he replied simply. "You don't have it where you come from?" Helga shook her head. "No," she admitted, feeling an odd prick of shame. It was the first time she had acknowledged a deficiency in her knowledge, in her homeland's practices, in her own assumptions. Miller smiled faintly. "We've been growing it for generations," he said. "Not for livestock, not for fodder, for people to eat. For taste, for families. You planned it right, and it never lets you down." Helga felt the weight of his words. It was a simple truth, yet it carried a profound lesson. All her life she had believed in the superiority of German efficiency, German planning, German knowledge, yet here, in this distant land, a single crop humbled her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She returned to the barracks that evening with a strange sense of curiosity burning inside her. For the first time, she wondered if her homeland had been too proud, too rigid, too dismissive of ideas it didn't understand. She thought of the starved fields in Germany, the hunger etched into every family she had known, and realized that innovation and culture could sometimes thrive in the least expected places. That night, she traced the outline of the corn cob she had eaten, imagining what it might be like to grow it herself. The pride that had once dictated every thought of superiority felt suddenly hollow. Something as small, as simple as a bite of corn, had begun to teach her a lesson that no officer's training could ever provide: humility, curiosity, and the courage to question everything she had assumed was true. Weeks passed, and the camp settled into an unusual rhythm. The American officers, seeing the German prisoners' growing curiosity, allowed them small plots of land to tend their own vegetables. Helga was quick to volunteer, requesting a section for corn. The guards raised their eyebrows but handed her a handful of seeds. She knelt in the soil that first morning, the rough texture of the earth unfamiliar under her fingers. It smelled rich and alive, a scent she had almost forgotten. Around her, the other prisoners planted beans, tomatoes, and cabbage. The fields, once a symbol of captivity, became a quiet space of agency. Helga's mind, always analytical, treated this like a project: measure the rows, check the spacing, consider sun exposure. But beneath the calculation, curiosity had become fascination. The seedlings sprouted faster than she had expected. Each green shoot was a small miracle, evidence of life and possibility. Elsa, noticing Helga's dedication, teased her. "Still thinking about your pig feed, Helga?" Helga smiled faintly. "Maybe pigs were smarter than we thought," she replied, brushing dirt from her hands. But inside she felt a growing sense of purpose. The corn wasn't just a plant. It was a living lesson in patience, observation, and humility. As the days turned into weeks, Helga began keeping notes, sketching diagrams of stalk height, leaf patterns, and ear development. She compared these new observations to the coarse maize she knew from Germany. The differences were staggering. Plump kernels, tender stalks, sweetness in every bite, a testament to centuries of selective breeding. For the first time in months, the camp felt less like a prison. The barbed wire still enclosed them, but the garden offered freedom of a different kind, the freedom to learn, to experiment, and to discover truths that the war had tried to suppress. Helga's pride remained, yes, but it had shifted, no longer arrogance, but quiet confidence tempered by respect for the knowledge she had once mocked. Even as the sun set over the cornfield, painting the stalks gold, Helga knew that this small act, planting a few seeds, had changed something inside her. And she couldn't yet know how profoundly that change would shape her life after the war. Helga's curiosity soon evolved into dedication. Each morning, before the camp roused, she would walk among the corn stalks, inspecting every leaf and ear. She began noticing patterns, how the sun hit different sections of the field, how the spacing affected pollination, how even the slightest change in soil moisture altered the sweetness of the kernels. Private Miller, ever patient, became her informal mentor. He taught her the intricacies of cultivation, the timing of planting, the rotation of crops, the importance of observing the natural rhythm of the earth. He spoke in simple terms, but the knowledge was deep, honed by generations of hands working the land, not by books or charts. Other prisoners began watching her, curious about the meticulous care she poured into the soil. They asked questions, tentatively at first, then with growing excitement. What kind of seeds were these? How did you know when to water? Why were the stalks so much taller than the ones in Germany? Helga answered as best she could, sharing what she had learned from observation and from Miller's guidance. The act of teaching gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since the front lines. Here, in the confined space of the camp, she was creating something tangible, not destruction, not command, but life. The cornfield became a classroom, a place where she could test her assumptions, admit her ignorance, and witness the slow, steady work of nature transform the earth. And slowly, the lessons extended beyond agriculture. Helga realized that her judgments about the Americans, their food, their methods, even their culture, had been formed without understanding. The pride she had clung to for so long began to soften, replaced by a recognition that wisdom could come from unexpected places, even from those she had once considered inferior. Each stalk, each kernel, became a symbol of possibility, teaching her that true knowledge required patience, observation, and above all, humility. As the weeks passed, Helga's fascination with corn deepened into something resembling obsession. She no longer saw it merely as a crop, it had become a teacher, a puzzle, a revelation. Each morning she rose before the sun, hands streaked with soil, eyes scanning the field for subtle changes she might have missed the day before. Her peers watched with a mix of bemusement and admiration. Elsa, once her companion in ridicule, began to imitate her meticulous routines, checking leaves and stems, learning to judge the ripeness of an ear by its subtle sheen. The other prisoners followed slowly, hesitant at first, until the small garden became a place of quiet learning, a sanctuary in the middle of confinement. Helga began keeping notes, drawing sketches of stalks, counting leaves, documenting the color and size of kernels. She compared the American sweet corn to the German fodder maize she had known, amazed at how selective breeding could transform a plant entirely. She realized that what she had considered useless and inferior was now capable of delivering nourishment, flavor, and even joy. Her curiosity spilled into questions about the broader agricultural practices in the United States. How had the Americans perfected this crop? How had they managed to maintain such abundance in a land untouched by the war? Every answer she found deepened her respect for the ingenuity she had once mocked. This growing understanding marked a profound shift in Helga. She had entered the camp as a prisoner armed with pride and prejudice, convinced of her own cultural superiority. Yet here, amidst the smoke of grilled corn and the hum of growing plants, she discovered that knowledge was not bound by nationality. It could flourish anywhere, if one was willing to listen, to observe, and most importantly, to taste. By the time the first golden ears began to appear, Helga no longer thought of them as mere food. They were a symbol of what she had been blind to, a living reminder that assumptions, however deeply held, could be overturned by simple experience. In early 1945, the camp received a visitor who would change the course of Helga's understanding, an American agricultural officer assigned to assess the POWs' work in the gardens. He moved with quiet authority, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning the neat rows of vegetables and corn stalks. His presence was different from the guards. He was there to observe, to teach, and to encourage. Helga watched him approach her plot, noting the tilt of his hat and the easy familiarity with the soil. He crouched beside a row of corn, examining the ears with a practiced eye. You have a good touch, he said, looking up at her with a small smile. These are growing well. Helga, accustomed to praise based on rank or military efficiency, felt something new, recognition for skill rather than authority. She replied humbly, I have good teachers. Her gaze flicked to Miller, who had trained her in these fields of knowledge. The officer nodded. Would you be willing to assist in some lessons? He asked. We're starting a program to teach POWs agricultural techniques they can take home after the war. Someone with your experience could be invaluable in translating and helping others understand the methods. Helga paused, considering. Her life in the camp had been defined by obedience and calculation, yet this was different. Here was an opportunity to contribute knowledge, to bridge a gap between cultures, and to learn in ways she had never imagined. When she accepted, it was with a quiet sense of resolve. She realized that the seed of curiosity planted by a single ear of corn was now blossoming into purpose. She was no longer just a prisoner. She was a student, a teacher, and a witness to something larger, a living example of the power of humility and openness. The small plot of corn, once a symbol of ridicule, had transformed into a classroom and a catalyst for change, and Helga was ready to follow where it would lead. The agricultural lessons quickly became more than routine tasks. They were exercises in curiosity, observation, and critical thinking. Helga immersed herself in every detail, from soil composition to seed hybridization, learning how the Americans had optimized crops for both resilience and taste. The precision fascinated her, methods she had never seen in Germany, applied not to machines or weapons, but to life itself. The POWs gathered each day, listening as Helga relayed Miller's instructions and the agricultural officer's lessons. She translated, explained, and demonstrated, often recalling her own observations about sunlight angles, water distribution, and kernel development. Gradually, she noticed a shift in the other prisoners. Mockery gave way to engagement, skepticism to experimentation. The cornfield had become a classroom of humility, a place where assumptions could be challenged without fear of reprisal. Helga began to understand that what she had dismissed as American frivolity was, in fact, ingenuity. The sweet corn they cultivated was the result of centuries of selective breeding, careful planning, and observation, a science that Germany had largely ignored. She realized that her previous pride, her belief in German superiority, had blinded her to innovation simply because it came from a culture she had underestimated. This revelation extended beyond agriculture. Helga started to see how deeply prejudice could limit understanding, how assumptions about others could prevent the recognition of truth. She reflected on her own upbringing, her military training, and the collective biases of her nation, seeing how these had constrained thinking, even in matters as simple as food. By the time the golden ears matured, Helga's mindset had shifted profoundly. The corn was no longer just a vegetable. It was a teacher, a symbol of knowledge that transcended nationality, a quiet proof that humility could unlock doors that pride could never open. As the months wore on, Helga began writing letters home, the first she had sent since arriving in captivity. She carefully chose her words, avoiding politics and war, focusing instead on the surprising lessons she had learned in the camp. It is not what we thought. The Americans have a kind of corn that is tender and golden. They eat it with joy. I think we have misunderstood many things. The words surprised her even as she wrote them. She wasn't confessing defeat or weakness. She was acknowledging a truth she had once scorned. The act of writing the letter was almost ritualistic, a quiet recognition that experience often spoke louder than ideology, and that understanding could be communicated across distance, even in the aftermath of conflict. She sent the letters through the censors, wondering if her family would ever comprehend the subtlety of what she had discovered. Corn. A simple crop. And yet, it had opened her mind to humility, to curiosity, and to the realization that knowledge and innovation often arrived in the most unexpected forms. Within the camp, the act of writing and reflecting strengthened her resolve. Helga began to imagine a future beyond imprisonment, beyond war, where such lessons might influence rebuilding her homeland. The letters were more than messages to family. They were exercises in thought, seeds of understanding planted for the day she would return to Germany. Even as the war dragged on elsewhere, Helga felt a quiet victory in these reflections. The taste of sweet corn, the care of the fields, the guidance of American mentors, all had combined to teach her that true knowledge required observation, openness, and the courage to discard old prejudices. It was a small, private triumph. But in a world ravaged by war, even the smallest victories carried profound weight. In May 1945, the news of Germany's surrender reached the camp. The prisoners gathered in the yard, a mix of relief, disbelief, and sorrow etched across their faces. For some, freedom was a distant hope. For others, it carried the heavy weight of uncertainty. Helga stood among them, her gaze fixed on the cornfields beyond the barbed wire. The stalks swayed gently in the breeze, golden and abundant, untouched by bombs or shellfire. To her, they had become a symbol of resilience, knowledge, and the quiet power of persistence. Private Miller approached her that evening, a small smile on his face. "You'll be going home soon," he said. His words carried the calm certainty of someone who had lived with the land long enough to trust its cycles. "Yes," Helga replied, her voice soft. But her mind was already racing ahead, imagining the fields she would return to, the ruined farms of Saxony, the people who would need guidance more than authority. Miller handed her a small envelope. Inside were a few corn seeds, carefully wrapped and labeled. "For your garden," he said simply. Helga's hands trembled slightly as she accepted them. The gesture, small and unassuming, carried profound meaning, trust, generosity, and the passing of knowledge across lines that war had tried to make absolute. For the first time in years, Helga felt hope. The war had ended, but understanding and rebuilding were only beginning. The corn, once a subject of mockery and scorn, had become a bridge between nations, between cultures, and most importantly, within herself. She looked out across the field one last time, inhaling the sweet, smoky air, and realized that peace often arrived in the smallest, quietest moments, a shared meal, a gesture of trust, a simple seed in her hand. By late 1945, Helga finally returned to Germany. The country was scarred by war, cities reduced to rubble, farms burned or abandoned, a population hungry not only for food but for stability and hope. Yet Helga carried with her something few others had, knowledge of advanced agricultural practices and a first-hand understanding of how a single crop, treated with care and patience, could transform communities. She began visiting local farms, sharing what she had learned in the American POW camp. Farmers were skeptical at first. Corn? Animal feed, yes, but edible, sweet, and cultivated for human taste? Many scoffed. But Helga had a story, a living proof, and she wasn't afraid to demonstrate. She planted the first sweet corn seeds on a small plot of land, guiding farmers through spacing, soil preparation, irrigation, and harvesting techniques she had observed. When the first ears matured, golden and tender, the community tasted the difference. Laughter replaced disbelief, and a quiet revolution began in those small villages. Farmers realized that innovation did not always arrive from textbooks or top-down mandates. Sometimes it came from observation, experience, and the willingness to challenge assumptions. Helga's reputation grew. She became known as someone who bridged the gap between traditional practices and modern techniques, someone who had learned the hard lesson of humility in a foreign land and returned to share it. She was no longer just an officer or a prisoner. She was a teacher, a pioneer, and a witness to the transformative power of curiosity and openness. The corn, once a symbol of mockery, had become an instrument of change. And Helga, carrying its lessons, began to shape the future of post-war German agriculture. Helga's work in post-war Germany expanded rapidly. Villages that had once relied on coarse fodder maize for survival now began experimenting with sweet corn cultivation. Helga traveled from town to town, sharing her expertise with farmers, local officials, and even agricultural schools. She introduced techniques that had been commonplace in the American Midwest but revolutionary in a Germany still recovering from devastation. Crop rotation schedules, selective breeding for taste and resilience, soil enrichment methods, all became part of the curriculum she helped establish. Farmers who had once laughed at her ideas now relied on her guidance, witnessing firsthand the yield and quality improvements that came from careful observation and application. Helga's influence extended beyond agriculture. She became a symbol of what humility and open-mindedness could achieve, demonstrating that learning from others, even former enemies, could be more powerful than clinging to pride or tradition. Communities that embraced her methods experienced better harvests, improved nutrition, and a renewed sense of possibility. The corn, once a foreign curiosity, had become a catalyst for recovery. In Helga's hands, it was more than a crop. It was proof that transformation could come from unexpected sources, that even the smallest lessons, a bite of sweet corn, a seed handed across a fence, could grow into profound change. By the end of the decade, sweet corn was no longer mocked or dismissed in Germany. It had become a staple, a bridge between past and future, and a testament to the enduring power of experience over assumption. Helga's work with corn began to ripple beyond the boundaries of agriculture. She noticed how food, something so simple, had the power to challenge deeply held cultural assumptions. Communities that once rejected novelty began to embrace experimentation, not just in farming, but in daily life. Families shared meals featuring sweet corn. Children grew up thinking of it not as fodder, but as nourishment. The transformation was subtle but profound. Conversations at village tables shifted from scarcity and survival to creativity and improvement. Farmers discussed not only cultivation techniques but also trade, nutrition, and sustainability. Helga saw that what had started as a lesson in agriculture had blossomed into a broader dialogue about adaptation, openness, and humility. She often reflected on the irony of it all. The very thing German prisoners had mocked as animal feed in an American POW camp had become a tool for rebuilding, a bridge between nations, and a lesson in cultural exchange. The Americans had unintentionally demonstrated that true progress requires curiosity, collaboration, and the courage to challenge old beliefs. Helga herself had changed. The pride and rigidity she carried during her early military career had softened into a thoughtful confidence, tempered by humility and an appreciation for learning from others. She often credited the simple act of tasting a single ear of corn as the turning point that reshaped her worldview. Through this lens, the sweet corn became more than a crop. It was a teacher, a cultural ambassador, and a living symbol of the possibility inherent in questioning assumptions and embracing what had once been dismissed. By the time the last American guards had left and the POWs were repatriated, the memory of those initial mockeries had faded, replaced by a quiet reverence for what had been learned. Helga often reflected on the irony. What had seemed ridiculous at first, a golden cob of corn, grilled over open flames, had become the foundation for her post-war mission. The same soldiers who had laughed at her disbelief had unknowingly offered the most important lesson of her life. Through simple observation, tasting, and repetition, Helga had discovered a principle that extended beyond agriculture: the value of openness to new experiences, even when they challenged deeply ingrained beliefs. She began to speak about these lessons in small circles, at agricultural meetings, and eventually at universities. Her story captivated audiences. A military officer humbled by a crop she had dismissed as animal feed, discovering that innovation and culture often lie where one least expects. Farmers who had initially resisted change began to adopt American-inspired techniques, recognizing that survival and prosperity depended on flexibility and adaptation. The crop, once a symbol of scorn, now embodied progress, possibility, and collaboration. Even within Helga herself, the transformation was permanent. She carried forward a mindset that valued curiosity, practical experimentation, and respect for the ingenuity of others. The laughter of the POW camp had long faded, but the lesson of that first bite, the taste of sweet corn, remained etched in her mind, a constant reminder that knowledge often comes wrapped in the most unexpected forms. As the years progressed, Helga's influence expanded beyond the small villages where she had first planted her experimental corn. She worked with regional agricultural councils, sharing the methods she had learned in the United States: soil enrichment, selective breeding, irrigation, and careful crop rotation. Farmers were initially skeptical, clinging to centuries-old practices. But Helga had proof, a single golden ear of sweet corn that had transformed her thinking, and now, through demonstration, could transform theirs. Her programs began showing measurable results. Yields improved, the taste of harvested corn delighted families, and nutritional intake increased in previously malnourished regions. Communities who had once believed corn was only fit for animals now saw it as a cornerstone of sustainable, human-focused agriculture. Helga also emphasized the importance of observation and experimentation. She taught farmers to learn from the land, to measure results, and to adapt practices based on evidence rather than tradition alone. The lesson that had begun with a bite of grilled corn in a POW camp evolved into a structured philosophy of agricultural innovation. Across Germany, Helga's influence grew. Agricultural schools adopted her methods, local councils funded seed distribution, and newspapers reported on the American corn techniques, brought home by a former officer. Helga's journey, from mockery to humility to leadership, became a case study in the power of experience and the dangers of prejudice. Through the simple act of planting, tending, and sharing knowledge about corn, she had sparked a quiet revolution that would shape German agriculture for decades, proving that even the humblest crop could catalyze lasting change. By the early 1950s, Helga Richter had become a recognized authority in agricultural circles across Germany. Her work with sweet corn had transformed not only the crops themselves but the mindset of an entire generation of farmers. She frequently traveled to rural communities, lecturing about crop improvement, the importance of experimentation, and the power of observation. Farmers often recounted the story of her first bite of American corn, laughing at the irony that a food once mocked as animal feed had sparked such profound change. Helga herself never tired of the story. It remained a vivid reminder of humility and the transformative potential of keeping an open mind. Her legacy extended beyond agricultural yields. She encouraged women to take active roles in farming, demonstrating that expertise and leadership were not confined by gender. The seeds she had planted, both literal and metaphorical, began to grow in ways she could scarcely have imagined. Cornfields became classrooms, villages became experimental hubs, and traditions slowly merged with innovation. Helga often reflected on the journey that had begun in a POW camp, under a blazing summer sun, with the smell of buttered corn wafting through the fence. That moment of surprise, of tasting what she had once scorned, had altered her path forever. It taught her the value of curiosity, the importance of questioning assumptions, and the extraordinary lessons hidden in simple experiences. In every kernel of sweet corn cultivated in post-war Germany, Helga saw the culmination of that lesson. What had once been fodder for animals had become a catalyst for knowledge, progress, and transformation, a legacy that would endure long after she was gone. Helga Richter's story ultimately became more than a chapter in agricultural history. It became a lesson in human perspective, cultural humility, and the unexpected power of food to bridge divides. That first bite of sweet corn, taken with hesitation and pride, had ignited a journey from skepticism to understanding, from mockery to leadership. She often reflected on the irony. A crop dismissed in Germany as pig feed had not only taught her about cultivation but had reshaped her worldview. It showed her that experience, observation, and openness to other cultures could yield insights far beyond what any book or manual could provide. Communities across Germany benefited from her work. Farmers adopted new practices, students learned the science behind the sweet corn, and women gained opportunities to engage meaningfully in post-war reconstruction. The ripple effect of that single ear of corn extended far beyond the fields, into minds, into attitudes, and into the very culture of innovation and curiosity that Helga championed. And in her final reflections, Helga often returned to the camp's fire, to the laughter, to the smell of buttered corn drifting through the evening air. It was there, in that improbable moment of connection and surprise, that she learned the most enduring truth, that the greatest lessons often come from what we initially dismiss, that humility opens doors pride never could, and that even the simplest of experiences, a taste, a smell, a touch, can reshape a life, a community, and in Helga's case, the agricultural future of a nation. Helga Richter's story is a testament to the power of curiosity, courage, and open-mindedness, a reminder that history, culture, and even food can teach us what assumptions alone never will. And all it took to start that transformation was a single ear of grilled corn.